Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to devote the entirety of the show to covering the latest polling from IRI, which is the International Republican Institute, which is actually an arm of the United States Republican Party, and they're known for their very comprehensive and professional polls. The first question we're going to start with, which is always the most important one, is what they call the right track, wrong track. Currently, 49% of voters think the country's going on the wrong track. 36% are saying it's going on the right track. A year ago, these numbers were reversed. It was actually 46% of voters who thought the country is going in the right direction, with 40% saying that it's going in the wrong direction. This is a 19-point swing between this time period, which is actually quite significant. Now, why this is important is this is almost the best barometer of sort of the maximum support for the ruling party or the party in power, because if the people are thinking the country is going in the wrong direction, they usually vote for the opposition. Then we're going to move on to what are the top issues standing out for voters, and they were volunteering these answers, not being prompted. And the number one issue was national security at 44%. Every other issue was failed compared to that by a margin of 25, 30 points. Obviously, what we have here is what everybody would consider a national security electorate, that being the most important issue for them. Then we move on to testing the trust of particular individual politicians. And the top two names that came up was Nikol Pashinyan at 13%, and Robert Kocharyan was second at 4%. Trust no one came in at 61%. In fact, if there was any person named Trust No One, they would win every election in Armenia. Now we're going to move on to the question which I ask about, if there was an election this weekend, who would you vote for? And the numbers are the following. Nikol Pashinyan's party, Civil Contract, comes in at 17%. Robert Kocharyan's party, his United Coalition Party, comes in at 6%. Every other party in Armenia, from the ARF to Dog's party to Aram Sarkisyan's, comes in at 1%. What's interesting is spoiled ballots comes in at 12%. And what this means is that people who will deliberately screw up their ballots so it doesn't count, that would actually make them the second largest party in the country. And would not vote this election comes in at 28%. Now, what does all of this mean in actual terms? In reality, this likely understates the strength of the ruling party because there is, once you shrink the electorate, which is likely to be the case where a lot of people are going to walk away, their numbers are actually going to increase in the same way that Kocharyan's party is going to increase, but they're starting with a substantial lead. So most likely, if you have any kind of an election, they probably cap out somewhere between the 30 to 35% range, being the top party in first place, with the opposition, the current opposition, coming in the 15 or 20% range, with the rest of the votes being split in different directions. Now we move on to the question of the voters are asked, what are the biggest failures of this government? And the top three were at 14% foreign policy, 10% it was poor personnel decisions, and third one was border security at 9%. And if you notice, almost all of these are actually security related. Then they move on to the question of what are the greatest accomplishments of this government. And in order, 11% of them said improved roads. 9% of them said ensuring security, which by this, I suspect they mean there was no war. At 7% said school renovations, and we've had lots of new school construction, especially in village areas, which are clearly popular. What is interesting here, if you look at all these positives, they're actually, given the fact that people's primary concerns are security, these are actually secondary issues, as popular as they might be renovating schools or roads. And what's interesting here is not what's in the survey, it's what isn't in the survey. Here you have a government, this particular government, that has probably spent somewhere between $4 to $5 billion buying new weapons and building modern military installations and defense structures, and they're getting absolutely no credit for it. And one of the reasons is, frankly, because they don't talk about it, since they don't want to endanger the so-called peace agenda. So what you actually have here, you have the issue, the voters' top issue and concern, which is security. And because they're pursuing this likely unrealistic peace agenda, which will not lead to a peace agreement, they're actually hurting themselves politically, but not highlighting the one thing that will help them allay the voters' number one concern, which are security and defense. Now we're going to move on to the question where they ask which institutions are actually trusted in Armenia. And number one is actually the armed forces, coming in at 72 to 24%. That's trust to not trust. And I think, again, there's a context for this, because when you say armed forces in Armenia, people do not think of the generals or this or that person. What they think is their nephew and their cousin and their neighbor son who's actually serving in the army, and everybody loves them. So I think this is what the number that reflects that. Then we're moving on to the church, and the church approval rating comes in at 58% approve or trust the church, 34% don't. And I think there's actually a bit of a bias here in this polling, because it doesn't separate the church or faith in general with the church leadership, which the church leadership is frankly far less popular than the institutional church or faith itself. What's interesting here, going back to the first one, is they test army leadership as a standalone, and they have the trust of 48% of voters, and they're not trusted by 44%, and it's dramatically less than what the overall army impression is. And I think this is actually the real number that allays people's concerns about how the army is run and who's running it. The least popular institution in Armenia, and this is no surprise given the disgraceful way that almost all of them have been acting, is 24% trusted. This is the parliament, and 72% which actually do not trust the parliament. So the leading political institution in the country is actually the least popular one in this case. The next question dealt with satisfaction with the Prime Minister's work. And what we have is that 59% of people were dissatisfied with the work that the Prime Minister is doing, and 35% are satisfied. These are worse numbers than last year. Last year, it was 50% who were dissatisfied with his work and 46% that were satisfied. This is almost a 13-point swing in negative direction. The next question was about the church. Obviously, the church is in the news, so they tested who's satisfied with the church, and that number currently is 58% of people are satisfied with the work of the church, and 35% who are opposed or are not satisfied. This number was 48 satisfied to 47 unsatisfied last year, which is a swing of 22 points, which is actually a significant number move if you see it. What is obvious here is that the war between the church and the Prime Minister, it's obvious that the Prime Minister is getting the worst end of it, while the church is getting the best end of it, which frankly is not that surprising given the fact that you actually get to vote for Prime Minister, but you don't get to vote for Vahapar. So this is obviously something that is, at this point, hurting the Prime Minister and his support. In these numbers, we actually have, given this discourse of the last couple of weeks, which I think obviously a lot of people are dissatisfied about. It's sort of an analogy to November 9th. In many ways, the last election in Armenia in 21 was actually decided on the night of November 9th, 2020, when the parliament was attacked, and there's really ugly, horrendous scenes that people saw where the speaker was almost beaten to death, women were sexually assaulted. And I think that turned off what would be the vital center of a lot of people who are actually, they don't love the Prime Minister, but they would vote for him given the right condition. They're sort of the neutrals. They're your teachers and your opinion makers in every community who were actually disgusted with what they saw. And I think what we might have here in this polling, given that the bump down that the Prime Minister has taken, from his fight with the church, is the same people who were, frankly, these are not political partisans, but these are people that have been disgusted with the discourse of the last few weeks, and that is totally understandable. The next question dealt with attitudes towards our allies and enemies in foreign countries, and the most favorable two countries in Armenia are actually France and India. France coming in at 89 approved to 8, India coming in at 90 to 8. And obviously this is because of weapon sales and political support from France, and from India it's also weapon sales. Iran actually comes in very high at 85 to 12, and I think part of this is probably sympathy for the countries, what the country has gone through in the last couple of weeks, being attacked and other things. When they tested specifically relations with the United States, it was viewed as 69% favorable, 25% unfavorable. This is actually a 20% drop from 2 years ago. If I was to put my finger on anything, this is probably the Trump effect, because we're seeing this all over the world, in which after Trump assumed power and all the sort of the vagaries of his policies and what is ununderstandable to most of the world, the United States itself has taken a reputational hit, and we're just seeing the result of this in Armenia. The next country that we're going to move on to that's relevant to us is attitudes towards Russia, which are 55% negative to 43% positive. These numbers were far, far worse 2 years ago. It was 66 to 31% negative 2 years ago, but that was a polling that was done immediately after the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, which is exactly the lowest point of what people think of Russia here. If you look at all of this polling, there's obviously a very consistent 20-25% of voters that are pro-Russia, inclined towards Russia, more often than not just skeptical of the West, which are obviously an important voter bloc, but if you look at them, they don't go beyond that. And the numbers that oppose them by being pro-Western are frankly far larger. So they're likely to impact future elections, but not likely to decide them. Next, I'm going to get to one of the most important questions, which was actually a balancing act where they test between are you pro-Western and you want to keep good relations with Russia, or are you pro-Russian and you want to keep good relations with the West? The numbers last year of people who said they're pro-EU, pro-West, but they want to keep good relations with Russia was 51 to 26. 51 support that, 26 don't. Now that number is 45 support and 34 don't. It's almost a 14-point swing in the negative direction. The opposite, which people are saying they want to ally with Russia and have good relations with the West, is far less popular, but it's obviously that the Western side has actually taken a hit over the last year. The thing that stood out most for me in this poll, and I've looked at polling all my professional career as a consultant, is what you see developing, which is a great generational gap between voters. And this is precisely between voters between 18 and 34 and voters that are 56 and above, and they have dramatically different views on almost every topic. Let's start off with the question of the peace agreement with Azerbaijan. The oldest group is supportive of it, 58 to 31. While the youngest group opposes it, 38 to 47. This is almost a 27-point difference. When you move on to this views of the church, the oldest group supports the church at 44% and opposes it at 49%. When you move to the youngest group, they support the church at 72% and oppose the work of the church at 25%, which is almost a 52-point swing, which is exceptionally dramatic. Then we move on to the question of voting to join the EU. The oldest group would vote 60% in support and 16% in disapproval. They would vote no. The youngest group, that number is only 42% support and 16% opposed. That is an 18-point difference in attitude. Obviously, they are pro-European, except they're just far less so than their older cohorts. Now, if you look at polling regionally, these numbers are actually the world turned upside down, in which you have the oldest, poorest, most rural voters who are culturally conservative and actually are the strongest base of this prime minister, who are pro the current peace agreement, pro-EU, and anti-church, while the youngest voters that tend to be better educated, higher income, oppose the supposed peace agenda, are more supportive of the church, and tend to be less pro-Western than the older voters. A few things about this generation gap. What is clear is that the youngest group will eventually win out because, frankly, they'll be around while the older voters won't be over the next few decades. Also, in most countries, this age demographic is actually irrelevant, because in most advanced Western countries, 18 to 34-year-olds hardly ever vote, have no economic power, and have very little impact in what goes on in the country. In Armenia, it's actually the opposite. It's because the youngest group is the most functional group. It runs or works for the most cutting-edge industries, ITs, and other things, and is totally integrated into the world for the most part, at least the leading edge of them. In harsh terms, if you want functional people in Armenia, you go to this age group and not to the other ones. Any political candidate or any political force that can activate these group of voters can quickly turn our political system upside down. Now, we need to step back and figure out, where does this generation gap come from? Where does this attitudes of the young voters, especially on issues of security, so different from the older ones? And we have to understand that this is actually generation war. Many of these people actually fought in a war or had their friends fight in a war or die in a war. And their views are actually shaped by two things: the endless aggression and the endless rhetoric that comes out of the Aliyev regime, to the extent that a lot of these voters do not believe that peace is even possible with such an enemy. And secondly, what they see is the views and the attitudes of this particular government, in which for them, this talk of peace is actually not equivalent of ending the conflict, but of endless national humiliation. There are many things uncertain if you look at the entirety of this poll, but there's one thing that's certain, is that the future of politics in Armenia is going to be nationalist and conservative. Now, this might not manifest next year, but will definitely do so over the next few decades. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Insights.
Stars shine like eyes, the black night side, the moon in silver dreams pours down in peace. Light of the night, beyond a purple flame of sapphire in orbit away.